This is Let Me Sum Up, your regular deep dive into recent reports on climate and energy. I'm Luke Menzel, recording today on Orangey Land, and as always, I'm joined by my two co-hosts, the magnificent Frankie Muscovich. Hello, Frankie.
Good evening, although I prefer being referred to as Vice President for Global Extortion and Marketing, and I'll have you refer to me in that way ongoing, thanks.
Is that just the set intro now, is it, Frankie?
Yeah, that's right.
Of all the roles that could be named, that's not one that you want to disrespect, Luke.
That's right. You should know better, Menzel.
It is true. Okay, my apologies, VP. Global Vice President for Marketing and Extortion at the Let Me Sum Up podcast, Frankie Muscovich. Hello, Frankie.
Thank you, Luke. It's a pleasure to be with you this evening from Gadigal Land.
And a man of many gnomic utterances, Tenant Reid. G'day, Tenant.
I will strive to be more decipherable in this episode.
On this week's show, we explore a remarkable new report that puts a dollar figure on the massive health system benefits of building performance upgrades. But first, we have some email correspondence from friend of the pod, Dylan McConnell, who enjoyed our musings on the shortcomings of integrated assessment models in episode 6, but noted that many of the same critiques could be levelled at AEMO's integrated system plan, which we covered back on episode 4. Now, apart from this exciting new reality where we have enough of a back catalogue for listeners of the pod to take balls of red twine and tie them to the various podcasts to draw connections, what do we think? Is Dylan onto something here?
Well, I would say Dylan has pointed a finger at us and said, why weren't we as sceptical of the ISP as we were of IAMs? And I would say fair cop in some ways. It does deserve a lot of scrutiny. I mean, it is a huge part of our energy debate, and it is worth looking behind the curtain a little bit.
I feel like we were intellectually curious about the validity of the ISP as a model, but more from the point of view of kind of the social construct around the ISP and the way everyone was kind of being sort of sucked into this time stream and of agreement. But Dylan's right. We didn't really look under the hood. We sort of took the kind of the conclusions of the ISP and the various scenarios as read without kind of unpacking the validity of the inputs and the process whereby those conclusions were being reached.
The context is important, right? The ISP has been produced in an environment where you didn't have a federal government that was wanting to lean in and really invest in the policy frameworks that are needed to manage this transition. So the ISP had become the de facto, plan for that, and indeed politicians would point to that and use it kind of as an excuse, in place of more proactive policy making they could be doing. And I'm very much here for the golden thread of this commentary, weaving together our back catalogue of episodes, because it does definitely sort of hark back to our last episode where we basically critiqued 830 fee opinions, and reflected on the influence of those people on the global climate debate, right?
And there were a lot fewer than 830 people on the Delphi panel that of experts that said what is most likely to happen in the electricity system to inform the ISP. So, but for all that, I think that the ISP has been a useful innovation. It's just not a blinding and incontrovertible window into the platonic realm of ultimate electricity system forms. It's just having a go. And if you have a go, I'm told reliably, you get a go.
I'm just trying to think how many Prime Ministers ago that was. That was just the last one,
just
right?
Just the one.
Seems a long time ago. I just have to give a shout out because there was a bit of back and forth in the correspondence with Dylan, and it started with, why didn't you sort of look under the hood of the ISP in the way that you did with IAMs? And then we kind of got into the back and forth about the dialogue, and Dylan decided in a subsequent email that the ISP was and I quote, giant energy system Hegelian dialectic.
And if that's not an aspiration for us all, I don't know what is.
Rebrand.
Indeed. I really enjoyed that one. But I want to thank Dylan for his email. And remember, if you have feedback or thoughts, if you want to tie a bit of red twine from one of our podcast episodes to another, you can, of course, send us feedback at mailbag@letmesumup.net. Shall we chat about a report?
We shall.
I'm pretty excited to feel outclassed by the statistical wizardry of a report.
The health benefits of improving the thermal performance of homes is much talked about. Yet while the evidence of these benefits has been accumulating around the world, we didn't have a good local study on the degree to which energy efficiency improvements could also improve the health of folk here in Australia. Until now, Sustainability Victoria has spearheaded the Victorian Healthy Homes Program, an ambitious 3-year effort that upgraded the homes of some of Victoria's most vulnerable and tracked the health outcomes. They've just released a report, and Frankie, it's pretty exciting.
It's really exciting. I got the email in my inbox that the outcomes of this project were finally released, and it felt like a Christmas present I've been waiting 5 years to unwrap. I was so excited. And I think the top note, or the most significant and important finding that I think we should reflect on a little bit is that it confirmed the hypothesis that this study was looking at, and they went full wonk, right? This is a randomized control trial. Tennant was talking about being outclassed by statistics. There's a lot of technical rigour in this program. But what it does bear out is that the health savings from energy efficiency upgrades far outweigh, typically in this study, the energy efficiency or the bill savings components, which for those of us in climate and energy land are the ones that we have focused on for many years because they're the easiest to quantify. And what this study told us was that for every dollar saved on energy bills because of thermal comfort and energy efficiency upgrades, $10 were saved in health costs. So, forget trying to hang your hat in a cost-benefit analysis just on energy bill savings. Their health savings are very significant.
I found this report, I found it really interesting. It went through the implications of relatively simple home upgrades to a depth that I hadn't seen before, and the exploration of the health benefits was very interesting. I think we should break down a bit more of what they did, but then I want to come back to ultimately what we can and can't use this data for. Because I think that there's some important limitations here that we need to be quite cautious about. So I'll just put a pin of my caution after your Christmas morning unwrapping, Frankie. I don't want to be the Grinch.
I see your pin, but I'm not being discouraged at this point.
Maybe my heart will grow 3 sizes this day.
So, well, let's break it down. I mean, the program was aiming to upgrade 1,000 homes for low-income households, and they were targeting, I think, homes in Melbourne's western suburbs and then in the Goulburn Valley. So you had an urban and then a more rural setting. And the focus was very much on pretty modest energy efficiency upgrades. I think the average cost of an upgrade was less than $3,000 in the end. So we are talking about some of the lowest hanging fruit and very modest changes made.
And they were doing things like insulation, draft sealing, improving space heating by installing a new reverse cycle air conditioner or replacing an old inefficient gas heater with a newer one, internal window coverings, stuff like that. In houses or dwellings that were typically pretty bad to start with, like representatively bad.
Yeah, and when we say pretty bad, it's probably worth also spelling out that In Australia, we have the NatHERS home rating scale, which you have to meet a certain star rating. It's just shifted to 7 stars, we all reminded you in our last pod. But those star ratings or requirements for energy efficiency were only introduced in 2004 in the building code. So a lot of housing in Australia was built before 2004. In Victoria, so the CSIRO keeps a lovely repository of all the data from NatHERS ratings. And their distribution across the housing stock would indicate that 65%, just over that, of Class 1 dwellings, which are standalone houses in Victoria, would be 2 stars or below. So that's 1.367 million homes.
Cold, leaky, miserable homes. 65% of the dwellings in Victoria.
It's very significant. And so whenever you talk to people about their experience of a winter in Australia's temperate climate, there's a lot of Ugg boot wearing, suck it up, she'll be right kind of mentality, because the existing older housing stock in Australia is very inefficient.
And I think there was some really interesting kind of commentary up the front of the report that sort of characterised, it's kind of the trap for temperate climates, where there doesn't tend to be that same focus on building thermally efficient buildings. So World Health Organization says that if you're a healthy human being, to be in a habitable environment inside, you should be aiming for, temperatures not going below 18 degrees Celsius. You dip far below that and you start to have health impacts. And there was this really interesting study that they used to frame up the conversation in a European context, to sort of looking at some of the prior art in this space. And they found that, as temperature drops, mortality increases, but the mortality associated with temperature dropping increases more quickly in Athens than it does in Helsinki. And I guess my line whenever we talk about this is that you do die from the cold in Helsinki, it's just you die very quickly. And so if you were in a poorly performing home, and so they make sure that they're not poorly performing, they build them properly, whereas in places like Athens and, dare I say it, Melbourne, where it's a relatively temperate climate, much of the year it's not so much of an issue, but there are these critical few months every year where it is an issue. You sort of have you have these poorly performing homes, and you'd have these kind of these health impacts which are just flying under the radar, both of the individuals that live in them, but also of policymakers as well, because they're not showing up as obvious cold-related deaths on health data unless you're really focusing on them.
And a lot of the the people who will be impacted by that are the people in these cohorts, potentially, in low-income and vulnerable households, and especially the elderly as well.
And it's worth saying that the cohort targeted in this was an elderly cohort. I think the average age was like 76 or something, right?
Yeah. The mean was 75.
Yep. And interestingly, a strong bias towards women. I think there were about 65% of the individuals in the study were women. I was looking for a little bit more commentary on that, but I couldn't find it.
And the age is that age issue is very central to my caution about this work. But another thing that is important to note is that of their 1,000 home upgrade target, they split them into half of them, they were going to give them the upgrade before the winter of the year that they studied, and the other half they get with a control group. They did not give them an upgrade, but they gave them the upgrade after the winter in question. And all of the data that's reported is just for the year of the upgrades. So they did some in 2018. They found it hard to get going. They got more done in 2019, and then they were all geared up for a big push in 2020, and then a little thing called COVID happened, and they did get a lot more done in 2020, but they couldn't get quite everything done but within the timeframes that they required. So, events happen. they did get overall, what was it, something like 800 homes upgraded.
860 odd, so a decent chunk, yeah.
Yeah. And a very rigorous, I think this is a terrific standard of research ambition paired with a public policy intervention. It's really great to see this being designed so carefully. They single-blinded it. They couldn't double-blind it. Like, people would know if they were getting their home upgraded or not.
I was just thinking about the stealth double-blind version of this. It's like ninja energy efficiency upgrades without people even knowing it's happening.
You're not allowed to look in your ceiling cavity for the next 3 years, FYI.
We put a magazine with a picture of insulation in it into your ceiling.
That's it. Well, should we just step out what they meant by single blinding in this instance? Because so it, like, in terms of the way that the program was run, the lovely folks at SV they had a delivery partner that they worked with, and that organisation is certainly known to all of us and a good chunk of our listeners, I think, in Moreland Energy Foundation, as it was at the time, or more recently the Australian Energy Foundation,
and even more recently the subject of a eulogy in the last episode.
I wasn't going to go there, but, you know, what an amazing legacy to kind of hang your hat on.
Yes.
Really amazing involvement in this work. So they were the delivery partner for this program, so responsible for conducting all of the in-house residential energy efficiency scorecard assessments, which were done prior to all of the upgrades in the homes, the coordination of trades to deliver the upgrades, troubleshooting with residents. So they were the front face of the program, and they were also responsible for coordinating with a range of agencies and organisations that helped recruit the participants in the study as well. So whilst the homeowners and the good folks working with MEFL or AEF on the upgrades knew, you know, who's getting an upgrade and who wasn't, all of the data getting fed back to the academic partner, which was the UTS, the University of Technology in Sydney, for analysis, didn't know what they were looking at. So the data for individual households was anonymised in the sense that they the ones crunching the numbers didn't know who'd received the upgrades prior to or after winter.
And maybe before we just jump into the detail of this, I was just reflecting on why this is so important. So there's this really important narrative in energy efficiency policy about capturing the multiple benefits. It's like if you only focus on the cost savings, you don't really tell the whole story. And health has long been one of the key things, particularly when it comes to residential energy performance upgrades, which is pointed to, often because of this issue of sort of thermal performance, comfort, also ventilation and airflow, and that being really helpful from a respiratory point of view. But that's just one of the multiple benefits. There's this flower diagram in an International Energy Agency report from 2014, which is very famous in the energy efficiency policy community, and it's got environmental sustainability and macroeconomic development and energy security and energy access and health and well-being. It's got 14 or 15 different kind of points. So this is all the things that this amazing resource unlocks. And we had Adrian Joyce from Renovate Europe out earlier in the year, and it actually turns out that it was a Renovate Europe report in 2011 that first characterised it in this way, and he recounted a story of how he had fights with the modellers who were trying to characterise the economic benefits of energy efficiency, particularly around the health question, because at the time in 2011 in the European context there wasn't enough data to really justify it. And so there's been a real journey over the last 10, 12, 13 years to really gather that data and build the evidence base for that case. And it's been popping up around the world, and there's been studies in Europe and the UK and the US and other places. But there hasn't been a really good study in Australia, and we're such parochial bastards that, we tend to wave away relatively analogous sort of situations in other countries that, you know, we could easily extrapolate from for our own context.
Yes.
And this program was also very intentionally seeking to build on the local evidence base to support that argument. It does note that really I think the only comparable set of studies in our region, and we are parochial, in some sense that's necessary because we are talking about temperate climates, and the point that you raise about, you know, you wouldn't be able to get away with crappy, energy performance of homes in Helsinki because you would die pretty quickly is spot on. So it does mean you actually do need to firm up an evidence base in countries where you do have these temperate climates where, you know, in a sense, you can afford, and I'm using big quotation marks around it, to get away with lower performance because it's not as visible in that you know, the people who are suffering from lower performing homes are not as visible in society, and, you know, you're not getting, you know, mass death every year because of cold weather. So I think it is important to note that the folks at SV were seeking to build on work that had been done in New Zealand. I think that was as far back as 2007, which took a similar approach, and that they did a randomised control study on upgrades of over 1,000 homes there. It was focused on insulation and tracking the health outcomes over there, and it led to a couple of significant programs that supported the rollout of home insulation and draft proofing. So, yeah, very significant and a good thing to reflect on in terms of the context and importance for the work. I'd really like to chat a little bit about the outcomes that were observed, and I think where the focus was in terms of the key variables that were being looked at across those things. One that I really seized on, and I'm not sure if you all kind of clocked that, I think, Luke, maybe you did in your opening comments, was around the time exposed to temperature. So that the central hypothesis of this study was to track the thermal comfort outcomes. The energy savings are, you know, in this study were a co-benefit and a useful kind of secondary measure, but weren't the focus of what they were looking at. What they did look at was the number of time that people in those households were exposed to cold temperatures, which in this study is defined as under 18 degrees, which is the threshold set by the World Health Organization as being, you know, an acceptable temperature for general populations to be comfortable in throughout the year. And
they made a significant difference to the temperature outcomes. Those less than $3,000 per house on average upgrades raised, just looking at temperatures in winter, raised the average temperature in those households by 1/3 of a degree, and by 1/2 a degree if you're just looking at winter mornings when the house will have cooled down the most, or people won't have been up with heating on typically, so the better thermal performance will be most on display at that time.
The significance in not just the finding, but the way this is framed. If you looked at the graphs, so yes, it was great to see that it had worked, and in a sense, I'm actually a little bit surprised in a pleasant way that such modest upgrades made that difference. Because when you think about home energy performance, houses are, you know, a system of a lot of different things working together. You can have, in a sense, you can't get amazing overall performance if individual elements of the house aren't working well. So you can talk about analogies with buckets with lots of holes in them and things like that. You can put more ceiling insulation in a house that has no wall insulation or floor insulation or draft proofing, and it'll help a bit, but you're not going to see, extreme improvements. And I think to an extent that's borne out here. But also, there are still the majority of those homes are experiencing periods below 18 degrees for over 10 hours a day in the middle of winter. Like, that's extraordinary. And let's remind ourselves that the 18-degree threshold is sort of set out as a threshold for comfort of the general population, not for vulnerable 75-year-olds, people who are struggling. In fact, the WHO suggests that 20 degrees is the better measure of comfort, or what's acceptable. And if you look at the temperature graphs across the spread of housing stock used in this study, like, most of the homes would be under 20 degrees for most of the time during winter.
Oh, just a sidebar on that. I feel like there's a Herald Sun front page in this report when you go to those points about, our elderly living in, just horrible houses and literally freezing to death. Again, there's some commentary which is, I think, treated in a very nuanced way, in a very careful way. But if you look at it, there's a clear implication that those houses which have had these interventions, the death rate, the mortality rate is going down. And if you extrapolate that out over the course of, I think it was 5 years, and you took a population of 1,000 people that had the intervention, had the thermal performance upgrade for this age cohort, and another 1,000 people that didn't, there would be 27 people still alive in the population which had the upgrades, which is remarkable.
And there was a heartbreaking chart in there of people's behaviour around when they heat their houses, and there were modest differences really between the intervention households and the control households, but a third of people in both groups didn't use their heaters at all unless they were very cold. And this isn't in the stats, but my interpretation of that is not that, these are hairy-chested 75-year-olds saying, I'm tough, I can take it, but that they don't think they can afford to heat their homes, and they're really limiting their use of vital services to sustain their health and well-being because of the poverty that they're living in, which is pretty bad.
I think this report does approach some of those areas that you talk, it doesn't go heavy on the commentary around survival and those things. Like, it presents that and extrapolates it, but it doesn't, I don't think it kind of really zeroes in on that in a big way.
There's a tabloid version of this report, and if you...
There is.
It isn't
but
that.
This isn't that.
How many error bars and confidence levels will be in the tabloid version, Luke? About as many as usual.
I mean, other things that would feature in the tabloid version, along the lines of the point that you just made, Tennant, were if you're setting out the other reasons why people would or wouldn't choose to heat their homes, and some of the results from the intervention household suggested, I think there were 47% less likely to go to bed early to stay warm.
Which I found heartbreaking.
Yeah, so the strategies that, people end up employing to avoid having to turn on, gas heaters or reverse cycle air conditioners and to climb into bed and snuggle up because it's warmer there. That's devastating to read in Australia in 2022. So it is worth pointing those things out.
And when I say tabloid, I don't mean sensationalist. I mean just a way of expressing the story that would cut through. We've spent, whatever it is, a few hours kind of wading through this report, and we're a bit wonky, so we were very focused on the numbers. But the actual story that sits behind those numbers is, as you say, Frank, devastating. And I feel like that's a story that needs to be told. And so I guess, that's probably something to consider in our day jobs rather than on this podcast. But,
here's my thing about this story, because I agree it is a pretty devastating story.
yes.
But it's also quite a specific story. So the sample here is low income, like broadly low income old people.
Yep.
And the finding that leaps out the most here to anybody looking at this is, wow, there's huge health savings or benefits, and that they're way bigger than the energy benefits, actually. And that is true with an asterisk about statistics, which I will unqualifiedly get to in a minute. But it is really specific to the context of this sample. And 75-year-olds, or people in the what should be the golden years, have much higher health spending associated with them in general. And so the savings that were identified here, which are savings to government, there's a non-measured here human benefit to
Quality of life, comfort, mental health, all of those things, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess it is sort of measured, but it's not in the dollar figures.
Yep.
The government saving there, it's like it is substantial, but you couldn't go from that result to say, and upgrading any generic house is going to deliver benefits like this, because it's probably going to deliver more energy benefits, because you'll have more people living in houses on average than in the largely single occupancy residences here. But two, the health benefits, at least in a single year, are going to be probably a lot smaller, because most houses are not occupied by 75-year-olds. Although you might get, maybe getting speculative here, you might get health benefits that last for the individuals over a much longer period, maybe. But it's just, I think this report is a great case for doing more of this program aimed at low-income elderly people, and more research as well. I think it's interesting but inconclusive or indirectly helpful when it comes to, like, should we be upgrading the whole housing stock? Which I think we probably should, but I don't think this report will prove it.
I think that's totally fair. I had exactly the same thought, that this builds an incredibly robust case for a subset of that upgrade retrofit agenda for residential buildings. It kind of leaves, for another day, the questions of what those health benefits would be, and I agree that they're likely to be lower within a less vulnerable cohort for, like, the general population. I guess the thing that occurs to me, Tennant, is that more and more 70-year-olds will be living in crappy Victorian homes as time goes on and as our population ages. It's also interesting thinking about our housing stock as a shared resource, and it's, we can target homes that our elderly Australians are currently living in, but we don't know exactly which homes they're ultimately going to be living in. So there's that kind of, it's almost a safety net. Yeah. It's a minimum expectation that regardless of your health, regardless of your age, if you buy a home, if you're renting a home, there should be an expectation that it's habitable and that it's not going to make you sick. Hot take.
You should be writing real estate copy, Luke.
I mean, I agree with both of those hot takes, and I don't think this study is claiming to be the evidence base for all, NCC upgrades, over time or kind of retrofit programs. But what I think it does signpost is that health benefits and productivity benefits, I think, can't be underestimated. So I see this and go, it's a really high caliber look at one cohort of Australians, and agree with all Luke's points about why you then can't segment the housing stock necessarily writ large to focus just on upgrading those. But there are other vulnerable or, other cohorts that would be worth looking at that would have different health impacts. Young children would be another one, and you find a lot of them across households in Australia, and they're also susceptible to to moderate cold and heat. I think it would be much harder in a sense to quantify health impacts to that cohort. Can't exactly interview a baby and find out how it's feeling.
Confidence level in gurgle interpretation. Got a paper in that for sure.
Absolutely. And the other thing I want to point to is, and this is very much focused in the residential context, but it's not as though these conversations aren't happening in the commercial space either. There is a lot of money and research and time focused from office building owners that I happen to, spend a lot of my day job working with, that are incredibly focused on the quality of the workplace that is provided for people, because even the slightest incremental uptick in human productivity massively outweighs anything people would be spending in their outgoings on energy bills in a large commercial building. So I think, just sort of thinking about the different elements of this is useful, but I totally agree with the point that you're making there about, this being like a very particular study of one cohort. Hey, can I say one more thing about the scope of these?
This isn't that segment.
One more thing about the scope of these upgrades. So it kind of goes to the messy point I was making earlier about, I think, the limitations on performance you can expect from, whilst I think those are meaningful gains that have been made in these households, but it's not as though that upgrade is going to see these homes operating at a 10-star level that's, comfortable all the time. We're taking them a little bit out of the danger zone into something that's less terrible, but not amazing still.
The Mediocre Homes Program.
The slightly less mediocre homes program.
The Aspiring Towards Tolerability Homes Program.
Well, let's not brand it in that way.
But the point is, it's kind of triage, right? This is not the big Renovate Australia, we're going to fix all the homes, and this is like, let's target really crappy homes that really vulnerable people are living in, and make them a bit better, so they're a bit happier and fewer of them are dying. Which has some value, right? It
does, but I think, if we were going to look at the proof points in this study and then design a program focused at vulnerable and low-income households, I'd be thinking a bit like Adrian Joyce's advice. We need to go the whole hog and do deep retrofits of homes. Do it once and do it properly. Yep. Just the reading about, I think, the logistics and the time and expense also involved in delivering, this scale of a retrofit program makes a case that we should be thinking about doing deeper retrofits of homes like this.
That is actually something that occurred to me while I was reading this, which I think you could argue is a missed opportunity of this study, which would be a third group where you did that, where you actually did a full proper upgrade to bring it into line with current construction code expectations, and then see what the health outcomes are of that. Now, clearly that would be more expensive, but in the context of a trial, that would be a really fascinating thing to unpack to help guide policymakers think through some of the pros and cons and the trade-offs that are associated with these various approaches.
Yeah, well, especially given the program administration costs. So they spent about $2,800 on average on the upgrades themselves, but they spent very close to that on average just in running the program. So all of this oversight, not counting any of the research costs, but the oversight by SV and by the Energy Foundation, doing photo analysis of all the upgrades to make sure that they were kosher. A lot of work was done to run the program, and it doubles if you take those costs into account. The payback period, the strict payback period for this program, doubles from about 3 years if you include just the direct upgrade costs and the energy benefits and the health benefits to about 7 years.
It's true, but only payback if you assume, for the sake of the argument, that the investment from the homeowner in doing the upgrade, if in this scenario where there was no administrator, I assume that this would just be a choice being made by the individual to upgrade their home. The vast bulk of those benefits are, of course, accruing to the state and federal governments.
Yes, they are.
Yeah.
It'll give us all a warm feeling to know that we're making the health system that bit more sustainable. That's almost as good as a warm house, I think.
Well, it's a nice bit of justification for governments to invest in the upgrade of that level of housing stock.
Yeah, Treasury should get in on this. Like, this is how you... this is a great way to improve the budget.
100%.
You actually help people, and you cut your ongoing expenses.
And I think there was a really interesting, and I'm very glad that they included this breakdown of the $800 odd that were being saved in terms of health system costs. 660 of them were going to the state level, and only 227 of them were going to the Commonwealth, which suggests that would be in state government's best interests, and that was largely hospital costs, I think, that were being carried by the state government. Really in the state government's interest to think about, how they can leverage these types of programs to reduce pressure on their own hospital systems, of which, they have carriage. So
here's the bit where I'm outside of my competence zone. He said boldly, presuming he wasn't outside his competence zone for the entire conversation. So the health benefits are absolutely central to the outcomes of this work. But when you go through the guts of the results, for every component of the dollar health benefits, for the Medicare element, the PBS element, the pharmaceuticals element, the hospitalisation element, the authors diligently note that the costs were lower by X dollars the occurrence of hospitalisation episodes or whatever else was lower in the intervention cohort than in the control cohort, but also that the differences were not significant. And then when you put it all together, it was lower, but it was not significant. And as I understand it, that means that given the size of the sample and the extent of the differences, the difference was not so large that it could not be explained by chance. And the implication of that is not that all this is meaningless, but that more research is needed.
I think this could be what we put on our T-shirt, Tennant. More research is needed.
If not tombstone.
Enemies of regression analysis and IAMs on the back.
The IAMs got us. That's what's on the tombstone.
I noticed the same thing. And in some ways, and again, not my area of expertise either, but it seemed like the conclusion was quite definitive given the caution with which that data was presented over the course of the report. For the most part, I think we've acknowledged that they have been, fairly careful in the way they've presented this information. If you're going to ding them for one thing, perhaps there should have been some more caveats around that number. I think you're right. I think that digging into this topic a bit more and learning from this study and looking at it in the context of different cohorts, as we've said, different models for retrofits, as we've said, that could be incredibly valuable and maybe firm up some of those conclusions in terms of those health system benefits.
There were some weird things with not the fault of the authors or anybody concerned, but like 2020 was a weird year.
Yeah.
And people were consuming less health services in this cohort, and like across the board, people were not going to their GP because they were told not to. They were avoiding hospitals for anything they could. If they had had 3 regular type years of data, these results could plausibly look like, I will irresponsibly speculate, could look a lot stronger.
I have the same thought, because the number of the upgrades that ended up having to wait until the 2020 year was about half of them. So it wasn't just that it was kind of one, year equal in proportion to the others. It was kind of back-ended the program. There are a lot of homes that went through the upgrade process in the last year. The other thing I think that we should flag here when we were talking about the analysis of the accrual of the benefits, they're only considering these savings in that 3-month period of winter. And, I think that's a really important kind of a note on this whole study.
Very conservative.
Extremely conservative. So that the benefits of having done these upgrades is going to play out not just over the course of one winter, but every winter that follows and every summer, because some of the interventions that were focused on, particularly insulation and draft proofing, would help keep the inside of the home a bit cooler in summer. So you could expect, benefits to accrue.
Heat waves up around Shepparton, not to be sneezed at.
Yeah, so that was a really conservative aspect of the study that we hadn't touched on yet. It's worth pointing out.
Specifically, they did unpack the forward benefits for kind of paybacks of programs, but in terms of actually assessing the health impacts, it was just in the 3 months of winter that they were focused on. And indeed, one could expect that they would roll on and be accruing to those occupants over the full 12 months. There was a little Easter egg in there, which was for the purposes of assessing these benefits, we're assuming there's one elderly individual in home. Guess what? If there's 2 of them, the benefits double and for the same cost.
So they should focus the next wave of this program on multiple occupancy, like Golden Girls type residential situations. And they'll really juice the numbers.
Also great for marketing.
That's right. Yes.
Well, we're on our shopping list of ideas. I started to think about what a program run out of the New South Wales government like this could look like.
I guess that's a question for the Let Me Sum Up resident buildings expert, Frankie Muscovich. To what degree can we extrapolate from this Victorian-based study to other parts of the country? Do you need to effectively do the same thing in the various climate zones that we're dealing with in Australia?
I would be really hesitant to draw sweeping conclusions from work like this, noting particularly the cohort that this was done with. But I think you can think about where some of the vulnerable cohorts exist in the Australian landscape, and you can define vulnerable in different ways. Socioeconomic age was one here, but if there's some really great work that's been done in Sydney through Resilient Sydney that maps where kind of key risks and so shocks and stresses sit from an urban resilience perspective, and access to healthcare and climate like kind of key risks in parts of Western Sydney where you have this kind of Venn diagram of low access to healthcare, existing health issues that require medical attention, quality of housing stock, and climate, and it all concentrates, over those parts of Sydney that mean I would consider, there are a lot of cohort of people in Western Sydney that I would consider vulnerable for different reasons. And so I think, I think it would be important to look at those things with fresh eyes. But what you could probably kind of seek to draw from this is that the health benefits of focusing on energy efficiency are not a small co-benefit. I think they can be significant, and it's worth investing the time to look at how that might be quantified. And it does add more strength to the arm in terms of a rationale for focusing on retrofits of Australian housing, because the quality story is not just a Victorian one, that's a national challenge.
The houses aren't just crap down here.
There's a tagline for you.
There's something that ties our nation together.
As always, we close out the show with one more thing, in which we all share something that is currently captivating our attention. Tennant, what have you got?
Well, I have the pleasure of promoting an upcoming National Energy Efficiency Summit.
What? Tell me more.
Yeah, it's the first that you've heard about it because you've been dissociating from organising it, Luke.
Yes, there's been a big push on, and the three of us have been involved with it, along with our good friend Kelly Court from ACOS, but I don't want to take over your one more thing, Tennant.
Well, it's going to be held in Sydney and online on the 6th of October, and it's really a point for people to come together to not just highlight the importance of a refreshed national push on efficiency, given the energy crisis that we have had many a corner on this podcast, the emerging problems of energy reliability and security later in the decade, and the driver of net zero and deep emissions reductions this decade, but also to get together on solutions across multiple sectors of the economy. The federal government will be represented. There'll be an international perspective from California, and there'll be a lot of Australian energy leaders, industry leaders, social welfare, the built environment. It's the place to be on the 6th of October. So we'll put a link in the show notes for how you can register to attend online.
We will. There's going to be a small in-person component, as you've suggested, but we'll be live streaming as the summit progresses on the afternoon of Thursday, the 6th of October. And that link will be in the show notes, but for your reference, it is eec.org.au/summit22. So we'd love to have you lob in and hear the good oil on energy efficiency.
I'd love to gently suggest our podcast listeners try crash the event in person.
Oh my God.
That'd be great.
my events team's head just exploded.
I'm going to stop now, but I feel like I earned my global VP for marketing and extortion stripes tonight.
Please don't listen to Frankie. Very, very tight guest list. Hey, Frankie, what's your one more thing?
Like, actually worried about that. You know, listeners at home, Luke had his serious face on when he was telling me to retract that incitement of your... Before I really get into trouble, I'm going to move on though. I was going to use my one more thing to do a big happy birthday shout out to an organisation that's near and dear to my heart. 2022 marks the 20th anniversary of the Green Building Council being in operation, and I was lucky enough to go along to a celebration of that milestone and a gathering of alumni last week. And can I just say how lovely it was to be reminded of all the amazing people that have passed through that organisation over the years. very satisfying to look around the room and see that there are all these sleeper agents out there working away, towards a more sustainable built environment, and just generally kicking goals no matter where they've gone on to. But it's a lovely community, and the organisation has had a really tremendous impact. In this country. Yeah, and, it does kind of bear saying that they're one of the most influential green building councils of anywhere in the world, and they've been enormously impactful. It is the standard for a lot of new commercial builds that are done in this country now, and very exciting to see them recently expand into the home space. So just more power to their arm, and happy birthday, GBCA.
Happy birthday, GBCA. And I thoroughly endorse your happy birthday. Also pass on my best wishes to Davina and the crew and all the various folk that have made a contribution over a storied 20 years. Who would have thought?
Hey, I also, being super sneaky, had a little wild card thing to throw into the mix. Call it a second, one more thing, if you will.
Two more things?
It's terrible. I mean, look, despite all evidence to the contrary, we don't always live under our energy climate rocks, kind of beavering away on safeguard mechanisms and the like. Stuff happened in the world in the last week, and there's a new British monarch in the form of King Charles and
/ Australian head of state.
Well, that sure, but I wasn't going to open that can of Republican worms on this podcast.
Just putting the facts on the table.
Soon to appear on a $1 coin near you.
And here we go. All I was going to remark on, and I don't think it's any secret that Charles, when he was Prince, had a few issues that he was really passionate about, and climate change was one of them. And I just stumbled across a book that he wrote a few years ago. I think it's called the Ladybird Book on Climate Change, but it's for adults, so it's meant to be. It's a simple explainer about climate, and I thought that was a neat little thing to remind listeners of this program, that I don't think it hurts our collective cause to have people in high places, regardless of your views on pro-monarchy or republic, to have someone like that supporting action on climate change.
Well, somewhat inspired by that, I might junk my climate-related one more thing and do one on pop culture as well, because what's actually been captivating my attention ever since I saw it with my daughter last Thursday night is Moon Age Daydream, the new David Bowie documentary, which is a remarkable piece of art. It's 2 hours of footage of David Bowie's life and concerts and interviews cut together effectively as a one seamless music video. And this is an artist who, was a bit of a polymath. He dabbled in all kinds of genres, all kinds of art forms. So there's, and a lot of it was actually video art. And so there's all of this amazing footage of him over, the course of his long life. And then the story part of it, the exploration of his life, is told through his own words, through things that he's said in interviews over the journey, and it's just integrated into the documentary. And there's a few little segments where there's an interviewer that's kind of asking questions, so you've got the context for what he's saying, but for the most part, it is just him and, the incredible milieu that he moves through from the early 70s right up to just a couple of years ago when he died. So hard recommend if you want to get away from climate and energy land for a little while and immerse yourself in something completely different. Moon Age Daydream in a cinema near you.
Love that.
Wow. And if you require to bend that around and make it forced to be relevant to climate and energy, you could say that, well, Moon Age Daydream was from the Space Oddity and Ziggy Stardust period of the Bowie opus, oeuvre. And speaking of the moon, the most recent season of For All Mankind, Apple TV alternate space drama, had climate change solved on Earth in the alternate 1990s thanks to helium-3 mined on, yes, the moon.
Tennant's got out his red string now.
David Bowie solves everything, not just from beyond the grave, but from an alternate timeline.
But can I just say, I have now caught up with the first 2 episodes of For All Mankind. Very impressed, very interested to see where this is going. No spoilers, Tennant.
Well, obviously, all the space missions go very smoothly. Everyone is safe at all times. And it's fine. It's fine, Luke. Don't worry.
I don't believe you. But on that note, we should probably wrap this up before this just turns into a second podcast featuring the 3 of us, which is entirely focused on pop culture.
Write in if you want to make it happen.
All right. Well, that is our show for today. We're all on Twitter. Frankie is at Frankie Muscovich. Tennant is at Tennant Reid. And my handle is at Luke Menzel. And you can, as we mentioned earlier, email us with feedback or something you want us to cover on a future episode at mailbag@letmesumup.net. Never miss an episode by subscribing to Let Me Sum Up in your favourite podcast app, and you'll find all of our episodes at letmesumup.net. But for Frankie Muscovich and Tennant Reid, I'm Luke Menzel. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you again soon. So we should talk about, because we could actually resolve it now, is this report from Tom worth reading?
I haven't gone through it yet, but it does look interesting. Climate Endgame, exploring catastrophic climate change scenarios.
Oh, gosh. Yes. I'm sold. I don't need to know anymore.
Hell, Tom.
How can these multiple strands of evidence be usefully synthesized into an integrated catastrophe assessment?
Yes.
Jesus.
And the one more thing for that episode, somebody can pick Cormac McCarthy's The Road.